Hello, and welcome to Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. My name is Ben Hauk, and I'm pleased to be able to introduce the 13th episode in our ongoing series. Celebrating the one-year anniversary of the launch of our podcast, our September 2023 episode features a roundtable discussion with IGS trustees Eva Berger, Susan Drucker, Thom Gencarelli, Michael Plugh, and Lance Strate, as they take up one of the most basic questions for the discipline of general semantics. What is going on? Their discussion touches on problems such as racism and retribalization, information overload and political polarization, chaos and complexity, AI and regulation, and how to make things better. Let's listen in.
Welcome to our September episode of Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. This is our 13th episode, and that means that we're celebrating our one-year anniversary. Can I get a big hooray? My name is Lance Strate. I'm here with Eva Berger, Mike Plugh, and Thom Gencarelli, and we're here to do a kind of roundtable episode, a WIGO, that is what is going on, the eternal question of general semantics, and find out what is on people's minds. And that's, of course, assuming that they have minds. Mike Plugh seems unsure of whether he does or not, so perhaps can we start with you, Mike? What's on your mind?
What's on my mind? I don't know. I feel like the world is sometimes seems pretty crazy, and I can't tell whether that's because I'm getting older or because the world's actually going crazy, or both. It's possible it's both. It's not an either or proposition. I feel like a lot of things that we consider to be stable markers of a society suddenly seem not so stable, whether they're education or politics or business or whatever they may be. And so the question is actually more important than the answer, I think. What is going on? I don't know exactly.
But the obvious solution would be more general semantics, right?
Always. Of course, always. Yeah, that's true. Well, I mean, that's the best thing that we can do is evaluate well, and we're never going to make sense of all of it. You know, the territory that we can map is what we can deal with, and the better we evaluate it, the better we can take, steps in the right direction, hopefully, and correct course when we don't. So that's, I think that's the hope and why I stick with general semantics so much, because I'm not sure if anyone's ever known what's going on, but certainly I feel like it's a very confusing time we're living in right now.
When you start by asking the question, maybe it's me, maybe I'm just getting older, or maybe the world is just really getting crazier. When I pose that question to myself, I always say, well, maybe the world's kind of always been the civilized world again, I guess, since the birth and evolution of our civilizations. Has it always been crazy? Or is it this a particularly fraught time among times? That's a question, Mike.
Well, I think it's always true, of course. Chaos is the natural state of the universe, right? Entropy is real, and as far as we know. And I think probably there's a combination of things going on. Is what we perceive to be more chaotic is important, because the media through which we are making those observations favors drama and speed and volume. And so it becomes overwhelming and seems much more dramatic than maybe it did to people in their own chaotic times. But I think what's true of the media through which we perceive and observe all of these things is true of all the systems that run them. It's not unusual, I think, because of the technology that we see the financial sector, inflate and deflate pretty regularly and rapidly and extremely. And that's true of our politics. I think you can point to virtually any sector and it's faster, it's the bionic man. It was the faster, stronger, better. The things that work well work really well, and the things that don't work so well are really bad. And so I would suggest that maybe there's a little bit of truth in the fact that everyone sees their own times as chaotic because it's hard to be human. And on the other hand, I do think there's something to be said about the conundrum we're in, where things move too fast and with too much volume for us to cope with, because we're still the same flesh and blood creatures that we were 300,000 years ago, more or less.
Eva and I all had the good fortune to study with an educationist named Henry Perkinson. He wrote, I forget the number, but definitely more than a dozen books. And the underlying thread in all of his work is that the species is getting better. We're reducing error. We're finding ways to improve our lot. And then we look around us and we say, well, yeah, but Henry, yes, I see things getting better. I live near the Hudson River, for instance, and the river is coming back because we've stopped polluting it. But then I look at all of the things that we're still doing that are heading us in the opposite direction. And and I once asked him, I was like, Henry, do you really believe that? Or is it just something that you've, used as the thread for 12, 15 books? He believed it. I'm not so sure.
I wonder sometimes what Henry would say these days, especially the idea, I think it's in that book called Getting Better, that he said, had there been television during World War II, generally, and the Holocaust specifically, it couldn't have happened because we would have witnessed it and we would have never allowed that to happen. And I wonder what he would say today with all the atrocities being broadcast. They're not only happening, we're witnessing it all, and we seem to not care very much.
Well, in all fairness, one of the things was that, and I think he would say, is that the fact that television and, for that matter, cell phone cameras are bringing these things to light has actually made us better. And a great example would be the George Floyd video, where it's not that incidents like that haven't been happening all along, but the fact that we're able to see it and to see graphically what appears in effect to have been an execution had generated outrage of the kind of an unprecedented variety, and in particular among the population, the American population, and really elsewhere as well, but they're not African American, and in that sense not directly affected by it in the same way. That is similar to what Perkinson pointed to, where a film of police in the South beating on African American protesters and turning a fire hose full blast on children and sicking dogs on Black people, that generated tremendous outrage that really served the civil rights movement and served to move things forward. In those terms, I think it is consistent. I will say that Henry did point to the idea that it's not consistent, that it happens a lot at the start of the new technology, and then things tend to get kind of evened out and lose that forcefulness.
Well, next to those examples that I agree with completely, where had it not been filmed, there wouldn't have been a trial and it wouldn't have ended the way it did, like the George Floyd case. If you look just in terms of statistics and numbers to how many people stand there filming instead of trying to help when terrible things happen. I'm in Israel, and one of the things that I find most stunning lately is that this cliche of the archive remembers, and since cameras and since the internet, everything is saved, and there's nothing you can say that will not be there forever, and you will be held accountable. And all the newscasts here do, I don't know if that's the same thing in the United States, but all they do is remind politicians of the fact that they said something that's the opposite of what they just said right now, just 2 years ago, where in the past I feel this would have been like the end of their careers because they were found to have lied before or lying right now, and it just goes by. Nobody cares that the archive remembers. So the cameras are there, and maybe it's the volume, maybe it's that we're desensitized because there's so much of it. So I do believe there are certain cases, and the examples that you gave, Lance, I think are really, really good ones. But I find that I see atrocities every day, and they just go by like another little story that maybe it's too much. We can't take that much.
I want to say one thing about TV, because it strikes me, for example, we often attribute some of the success of the American civil rights movement to the fact that people witnessed atrocities on television. Television had that position where there was not a divided attention, so that when you saw those, you couldn't look away because you didn't look away from television. I don't know if we have that same phenomena exactly in the current media environment, where you get some of that idea that witnessing something atrocious will move you to shift your opinion or change your action, your behavior, your beliefs, or become politically active. Except that I feel like in that same space, that we witness these kinds of atrocities now, there's equal, or I don't know if it's equal and opposite, but there's certainly something that seems like equal and opposite reaction, where there's also room to deliberate a justification for said behaviors. And that justification becomes part of an identity marker where people, for example, adopt a thin blue line symbology and these kinds of things. And so where we think that media have offered a space for us to witness and recoil and change, especially in the environment we have now, we witness and some don't recoil, some celebrate, and the change is solidarity, where they held those private opinions about strong arm police tactics and racial, sensibilities and these things in private company. We recognize that there are likely millions of others like ourselves who hold those beliefs and now can celebrate and use them as a badge. I was just in a classroom before we started recording this where we were talking about Judith Donath's late 90s Identity and Deception in the Virtual Community, where she puts in print the phrase trolling, and busy with those students, talking to them about how we can learn about the kinds of communicative behavior we engage in physical space and whether or not we see them translate or recognize them in some form similar or different online. And what we ended up with was a little bit of a reverse to that thinking, where the discussion is that whatever people think of Donald Trump politically, there are plenty of things that he did that he was criticized for, which also are true of Obama and Biden alike. And he became sort of a flashpoint for certain things because of what he said and what he did. But it strikes me that as one of the most successful social media personalities that we've ever seen, that those folks who were inclined to hold different kinds of racial animosities or to seek strong-arm police tactics and things as a remedy to what they perceive to be an increasingly chaotic world would have remained more private, I believe, in the television era. And given the strength of his voice, his presence, and the sheer follower count associated with every comment, instead what it did was it drove more identity work online. And we've seen the kind of trolling that my students and I described as lighthearted, instigating in physical space and more hateful in its manifestation online. We saw sort of a flip where there's now permission for the kind of trolling that people do to become increasingly hateful, where physical violence is not a mitigating factor to the trolling behavior. In fact, it's something that they wear proudly. And so I don't think television quite did that. We sometimes, I think we teach that, when I think it was in the 70s, we turned to the if it bleeds, it leads things, where people started to believe their communities were more crime-filled and dangerous than they actually were, than the statistics showed because of the presentation of the news. I don't see that necessarily manifested in the same degree of identification and action and sort of hateful behavior that we see now. So yeah, I think lessons are important from the television era for sure, and I do think we see some carryover, but I think we're seeing something different in the nature of the multi-directional kind of aspect of the media.
I actually want to go back, not just, Mike, to the beginning of what you said, but also back to Eva. A former colleague of mine, we had this discussion, and this is his ideas. My former chair at my previous institution, a guy named Larry Londino, who talked about the beginning of the civil rights movement differently than you just talked about it vis-a-vis television. And what he said was, so suddenly the folks who were in Hollywood producing television shows, entertainment shows for the first time, are putting out these shows. Some of us maybe remember the names if we don't remember the shows, like Father Knows Best and My Three Sons, and the nice white family in the suburban house with the picket fence, and the father comes home for dinner and the wife is holding out the mark. All of these silly cliches to us at this point. But what my colleague said is when people who didn't come from that world saw that depiction, they said, I'm sorry, wait, this is completely alien to me. People live lives like this, or this is a model for life that I don't understand. And once they saw that in the ways that, again, we mistake the media reality for reality, they said, well, wait, I think that, we deserve to know that this is possible, and we deserve to have this if it does somehow reflect reality, at least a part of what it reflects. And so that created the impetus among people who were not white living in the suburban picket fence house, right? But to go back to Eva, too, Corey Anton wrote a piece, I can't remember the title off the top of my head, just a couple of issues back, and etc., about exactly the kinds of contradictions that, Eva, you were talking about. And of course, Hannah Arendt wrote about this too, and talking about totalitarianism. that, with respect to propaganda, you can contradict yourself. You can now be called on it with video and audio evidence, and it doesn't matter, right? That the response now, and especially if you hammer home the response to counterbalance it or sweep it under the rug or whatever, I think that what's happening is that when we move out of an age of television, and I know, Lance, you've written about video on the internet as just an extension of television, right?
Yeah.
That once we move into the age of the internet and social media and all of these millions of different sites clamoring for attention, there's so much information overload that I think people are just inured to all of the content of all of the discussion, and they think that it's all political and ideological, and the response of our students.
This information overload is when I talked about becoming context blind. One of the examples that I gave was that there was now a need to label something satire for people to understand that it's satire and for them to not take it seriously. A sort of a news program on the internet here in Israel every day, very right-wing, very racist, has now taken it to the next step. And it is intentionally labeled as satire without it being satire to avoid being sued.
That's
It's journalism. Now people may understand that when something is satire, but now it's cynically used. The word satire is cynically used to say whatever you want and not be sued in court.
Well, there is that idea that the McLuhan folks like to toss around of Menippean satire, which is actually addressed at social criticism. I think it's really, it's hard sometimes to put things into perspective, and thinking about my childhood and the way things were in the 60s. And I think things were much worse at that time as far as racism. I remember George Wallace as the third party candidate for president. Actually, me and my friends, and all of us being like, Jewish in New York, thinking like, if this guy actually were to win, we're in trouble, feeling like this is sort of the start of a kind of Nazi movement. And there was, to a large extent, kind of apartheid that existed, and not just in the South. I mean, it was also happening as far as ghettos and neighborhood restrictions in New York and everywhere else. It's hard for me to see today, as much as troubling as many of these things may be, and even to see someone like Trump, as much as I would certainly say that he's by far the worst that we've ever had. And yet, on the whole, Nixon, is arguably was scarier, not the least because he was much more competent. And there were actually good arguments that people made for defending him because he was, in that sense, efficient rather than being, this complete bozo who couldn't get things done. What is worse in that sense, it's a little hard to say. Some of you, of course, may remember that Neil Postman had his 10 rules for how to live your life. First one is never move to California. But I forget what number it was, but one of it, or I don't know if it was that or if it was one of Nystrom's nuggets, but it was to remember that, to keep in mind every day that you were not born you're not in a concentration camp, which is to say that, hey, I look at my parents' time, and they're both Holocaust survivors, and this is nothing. This is like, as we say, first world problems. This is not like living in a war zone. It's not like being, right now being in Ukraine and having to deal with bombardments and the Russian aggression that's going on there. There's much worse that's going on. And in terms of racism, in terms of so many things, we've made progress. There is backsliding. One of the things we have trouble with is just to really recognize a kind of oscillation that goes on where, we do move forward. I think this is back to Henry Perkinson. We make progress, but it's not uniform, homogeneous progress. We make maybe 3 steps forward and then take a step back, that there's always a countercurrent and a reactionary forces. But on the whole, we have been moving forward, or as Martin Luther King put it, the arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And I do believe that he had that kind of prophetic voice, prophetic not in predicting the future, but in speaking from a moral and ethical standpoint in identifying that. Also think, in a related sense, the sociologist Orrin Clapp had this book called Opening and Closing, and he basically said that society, and this is like a systems approach, that it goes through periods of openness and, where we're open to change and new things, but that puts a lot of pressure onto things. And then after a certain point, it has to close up again for a while. And so we go open and close, like we don't eat constantly. We have to eat and then we digest and then we go back to eating. In the same way, the 60s was a time of a lot of openness, and then things kind of closed down again. We think of kind of like the conformity of the 80s, and right now we're in a very open period in a lot of ways where things feel chaotic, but that will resolve itself at some point. But I want to just take this opportunity now to note that we have a latecomer. We'll forgive her for that, but Susan Drucker is here with us as well to join in on our discussion. Hi, Susan.
Hi, sorry I'm late, but I'm very happy to be to join in the discussion. Listening to this sounds like a very rich and broad-ranging one. Can I just pick up on some of this? Because one of my reactions to what I've been hearing, I think the elephant in the room is that in this system, the change in the system is certainly a very different media environment. And so part of what we have to grapple with is the issues of not only information overload and within the systems approach, it just looks to me like this added element of changes in the media environment that seem to be occurring at ever faster rate. Seismic changes have to be considered. It seems as if there isn't a day that goes by, an issue that I try to deal with that doesn't end up with, well, how do we deal with the new media environment? How do we deal with, I'm tired of hearing of it, but how do we deal with AI? So if it's information overload, but the overload is generated by artificial intelligence, then aren't we dealing with something substantially different? So forgive me if you've touched on any of this before I joined in, but it just seems to me that that's an element that becomes, and I think all of us would say it's always been an important feature. There's a degree of urgency that I sense that I hadn't necessarily sensed before.
I agree. And I just want to go back to some of the things that Lance said. I tend to agree with some of your optimism and some of your analysis that if we close down and we open up again, and if you filter everything through the Holocaust filter, you can definitely be an optimist. But that's where I think you're a little bit ethnocentric, if I may. I'm sorry. I invite you to move to Israel. I invite you to move here for a month, maybe two, and witness what's going on here. This is the Jewish state established after the Holocaust to give a home to the Jewish people. And just yesterday or 2 nights ago, Yom Kippur, really bad fighting broke out in Tel Aviv, Dizengoff Square, if some of you know where it is, really central place. On the night of Yom Kippur, with the Kol Nidre prayer, some people tried to set up partitions to separate men and women, which Tel Aviv municipality and the High Court of Justice of Israel had banned because it's public space. This is something that's allowed and respected in synagogues, especially Orthodox synagogues, and it has been banned by the High Court of Justice in Israel. It was terrible to see. It was incredible that on the most sacred night for Judaism, there was fighting on the streets. It didn't get violent, but it was verbally quite violent, and it had to do with very extreme right-wing messianic groups, missionaries, which Judaism never was, trying to take over. It's part of this larger thing going on. And if you ask me, I think the problem begins with the idea of a state that is supposed to be both Jewish and democratic. And I think that's a contradiction in terms, and it's very hard. And there's no real separation of church and state in Israel. What came after is what's so terrible. And this is how I connected to what you were saying before, Lance. The things that our prime minister said in the aftermath of this thing, she said that on the holiest day to Judaism, left-wing protesters riot against Jews at their prayers. I mean, how do you unpack this? These were Jewish people, only not willing to accept that there's only one way to pray, insisting on keeping, public spaces public and open and equal. And the word anti-Semitism has been flying around for the past 24 hours, uttered by Jews against Jews. I'm going to have to write something about this. I don't know what yet, but you say the Holocaust is like this point of reference. And if you look at that, everything that happens after is better. And you said apartheid, and it's so fitting to a state that, is occupying another people. We're fighting for democracy, but not democracy for all. It may just be that I'm desperate living here right now that I can't be so optimistic, but it feels like we're in one of those bad doubts in history. If you're right about it getting better, I'll be happy.
Well, I still don't see how that compares to, that's the sort of thing that can be very upsetting, but compared to much more violent and more tragic circumstances on the whole, I think
it's hard to compare, but I think you should talk to Palestinians and see what they think.
Right. But, again, I mean, it's not to say that all the problems are solved, or that there aren't ways that things get worse, but that the overall tendency, I think, still has been for things to be better over time. I think it still holds up, but I see, I'm going to let Thom and Mike go ahead.
Just real quick, for those of you who are listening, by the way, we're all on Zoom, so we're looking at each other, and I saw that Mike wanted to talk, but I just wanted to say this. Eva, on this side of the ocean, plus a sea, we read about and hear about the things that are going on over there, but with respect to what is going on, the more you're I don't want to turn this into the Eva show, but the more you're willing to tell us from your point of view what's happening over there, because it is what's going on, but not what's going on for us here, and we're only getting it second and third and fourth hand.
I'm just happy that your president or mine as well, because I'm an American citizen as well, but I'm happy your president has at least put some limits on what he's willing to take from the biggest friend of America in the Middle East. He met him, but he met him in New York and not in Washington, at the edge of the UN assembly. Let's not turn it into the Eva show.
I always like the Eva show. Are you kidding me? Since I read it the first time many years ago, I've always wrestled with the way that McLuhan describes sort of the retribalization. And I think part of it is sensitivity to language and how that word can be interpreted in ways that are unflattering or how it may be inaccurate in some anthropological ways, perhaps. But I think the sentiment, the thing he was trying to point at holds very true about electronic media and the disorienting quality of electronic media to existing identities. Any new media revolution will result in this sort of thing. But, I think in particular, we might compare the things that follow, say, the Holocaust, or say whatever sort of major situation we'd like to point to that was terrible and historically condemnable, and say, okay, they're better, except that didn't happen all at once, and that any major sort of catastrophe is preceded by a number of factors that took time to bubble up. And so, on the one hand, listening to Eva's story, it strikes me that we see not only sort of this McLuhan-esque retribalization among people where Black Lives Matter finds themselves up against the thin blue line folks, or you have conservative Jews in Israel who would like to have a more traditional public culture around gender, and all these kinds of issues you can point to wherever they may appear. But the overall phenomena, I think, is one of the things that leads to disorientation broadly, and is where the danger exists, because it represents something like a moment of chaos where there's a void of identity. And that other thing that McLuhan says that I think he gets from Hannah Arendt is all violence is a quest for identity. And so in this void where we see chaos around the idea of our established identities, what's left is finding close bonds with people who we think are similar to ourselves, followed by acts of violence, psychological or physical, across the globe. And the real danger, I think, is when there's a crystallization where folks who feel the same general sentiment about who they are and where they are and who's to blame and so forth find each other and create political solidarity among one another. I think that's the danger that people really were paying attention to, where some people were distracted by, say, Trump or Bolsonaro, and others were more concerned with folks like Steve Bannon and the project to stoke Hungarian conservatives and South Korean conservatives and American conservatives and French, the Le Pen folks in France and so forth, and to try and create solidarity through identity grievances that could be traced in some way, at least, to this thing that McLuhan was calling retribalization. And I think on the one hand, you can point to a lot of ways that the world's gotten better. That we're very fortunate not to live in the midst of some terrible catastrophe, climate change accepted. I'm not sure it should be the exception. Perhaps that's the thing we should all be screaming about right now. But at least sort of in the everyday physical political world, we don't measure up all the things in some as terrible as a Holocaust. But the history books, if there are such things, the history stories will be will probably find ways to trace all of these little things back to whatever terrible thing happens next, hopefully.
Mike's point about Hannah Arendt, it reminds me of course, the phrase, the right to have rights. And I think part of what we're talking about from all sides of the political spectrum is a feeling of kind of disenfranchisement and a reassertion of the right to have rights. The only way to have rights is to engage as a citizen. I think that may be at the heart of what some people feel they're losing.
Another example, by the way, is Modi in India. I mean, that's a very big one. I mean, in a sense, the biggest of all, because they have the largest population on the planet. But I wouldn't debate the fact that we are seeing enormous disruptions, and I think part of it is that our political circumstances have changed dramatically. And when we talk about rights and rule of law and all of these kinds of things, that this all emerged out of a very different kind of semantic environment and media environment. And we find ourselves in a radically new kind of environment, and we're not entirely sure how to navigate it yet. So I certainly would agree with the retribalization as being part of that. I'm just not sure that that things won't reconfigure, that one of the rules, again, applying systems thinking, is that when you introduce a bit of chaos into a stable system, and if there's too much chaos, of course, the system collapses and that's it. It's the end. And that's what we're afraid of. But a bit of chaos can be good because it forces the system to reconfigure, does so in greater complexity, which could be exactly where we need to go at this point, especially trying to figure out how to establish a global system. And I know the current right now is against that direction, but how to establish a global system that really would be equitable and workable, rather than one that's just a bunch of nations vying for dominance or vying for their own piece of the pie.
I just have a question to follow up on that. When we're talking about the systems perspective and how a little chaos can sort of, reorient things in a way that some kind of creativity in the system allows for growth. But I'm curious, when we're talking about systems and we're talking about the global system, the human life world system, I think this is where maybe you can help with some Nicholas Luhmann or something. But we made these systems, and humans are the ones that are operating these systems. And the concern that I would have is that at a certain point when we made these systems, we made them out of things and skills and techniques and so forth that we understood relatively well and had relatively easy control over, or we had relatively sort of manageable control over. And as we've created technologies that have reworked these systems, I feel like perhaps we're getting to a point somewhere, and AI is a decent jumping off point for that, I suppose, but we've injected technologies that are faster, smarter, and better into these same systems. and supercharge them in a way that maybe our control and management of them isn't so easy or facile any longer. And so on the one hand, we're at a tipping point where maybe all this stuff will produce tremendous creative energy and we'll emerge from it with a new order it's a new renaissance of some kind, or we'll call it some sort of thing. And on the other hand, maybe we can't control it at all and we'll just destroy ourselves, which is the other end of the chaos that enters systems. So I don't have an answer to which one it is, but that would be my question is, where are we? Are we at a point where we can still survive and control and manage these kinds of things enough? Or are we at a tipping point where they're beyond us?
I'm not sure why you think we could control it in the first place.
Well, we've done it. Well, there's social scientists and engineers and all sorts of folks and financial experts, economists who have shaped and given direction to things, and they haven't always worked out particularly well, but the catastrophes have been in the order of terrible but survivable. And that's my curiosity, is whether the same flawed human beings with far more extreme circumstances around them can still muster the capacity to steer the ship.
I don't think it's ever been steered, though. I think we've never had, that people have been trying to, but they don't really, I haven't been able to. I would say just on the AI that, one of the historical patterns about information overload, because this isn't the first time we've had that, and that whenever we have information overload, sooner or later we develop means for trying to manage that. So that, and I've made this point before, that Aristotelian logic, for example, was a response, as much as we denigrate it or want to move past it with non-Aristotelian systems and general semantics, in Aristotle's day, there was just too much information, because suddenly they have the alphabet, the Greeks have the alphabet, they're collecting all of this knowledge in tons of scrolls and don't know how to manage all that information. And so logic becomes a means of managing that information. And later on in the print era, we developed things like table of contents and indexes and just page numbers, which never existed before, as a way to manage information. And the computer ultimately becomes an information management tool. I'm thinking that, and this is not to underestimate the concern we have over AI, but that one of the positive functions for artificial intelligence is, in fact, to restore those barriers and filters that, Postman and Technopoly talk about having been broken down, that the AI can be used to create a way of managing information overload for us. Because even you think about Google search as a means to manage the overload of there just being tons of information on computer systems all over the world, and how do you find anything? And those of us of a certain age may remember where we just sort of wandered aimlessly from connecting from one computer to another and looking at whatever files were being stored there, or later when the web comes in, linking, and that's where we talk about browsing, because it's really just linking, following links from one place to another. When search engines come in, they give us a much better way to access and manage all of the information out there. But still, you look up many different topics on Google, and you get back thousands of pages of possible results. And how do you manage that? That becomes an overload in and of itself. And the thing you're really looking for might be on page 324 of the search results. How do you really find it? Well, that's where AI may come in and at least have, in its positive possibilities, the ability to help us deal with that. And I know Thom and Sue want to respond to this because they think it's stupid.
I just want to say really quickly that I respectfully disagree. I think that AI is just producing more information overload. But go ahead, Sue.
I agree with some of what Lance says in terms of how historically, and then even the history of the search engine is a way of managing and dealing with information overload. But what troubles me is putting in historical context I see the world through law-colored glasses, regulations. Throughout history, people involved with creating the media innovations that we're talking about and the industries that have been built around them, they always have consistently taken the position that we can manage ourselves, that we're on top of things. And if there are any rules that need to be created, we can do it. If there's any monitoring, if there's any classification, we're on top of this. And the attitude throughout history has been, we don't need regulators. We can regulate ourselves. We can regulate our own inventions, our own institutions. And what I'm hearing in terms of AI, somewhat social media, but certainly AI, for the first time, is industry leaders saying, yeah, this is bigger than what we can handle, and we may need some type of regulatory system, governmental regulation. We need something. We need help on this. And the doors are suddenly being opened. Last week, there were congressional hearings where you had Elon Musk, and you had the head of Zuckerberg, and you had the head of ChatGPT, and you had them all up on Capitol Hill, and basically they weren't closing the door to any kind of regulation. They were saying, this is bigger than what we can handle. I've never heard that before, which makes me really sit up and take notice.
I think an interesting part of this is, or at least an attempt, which may turn out to be useful or not, but this idea of prompt engineering is an attempt to get some control or some management over the overload. And I think it's counterproductive, because if we're going to use large language models like that, we might as well let humans talk to it the way they talk and not start buying formulaic sentences that get you good results for marketing purposes, but to actually speak to it naturally. But that makes us feel uncomfortable because we lose control, or we feel like we're managing it less, or we want more regulation.
But that's after he invented the web, Tim Berners-Lee was working on the semantic web. And that was really the idea, was simply that rather than having to look for specific websites, you just want to ask the computer, ask the web a question like, what's the distance between the Earth and the moon, or what is the capital of Uruguay, or whatever the question might be, and get a response, get the data, the information back. Information, please, as the Almanac used to say. Obviously, there are other functions that AI are fulfilling, including the creation of new content. But does that really, I see that the potential there has more to do with managing the content that's out there. And, as Pursue's point is that just the ability to research all of the legal cases in a particular area, rather than leaving it up to the best that a human being can do, but to get a full kind of summary of that requires this sort of technical process that AI can deliver. Or the analysis of an X-ray, for example, can be done more completely by an AI. And I don't want to minimize the potential concerns that exist there, but just to note that when it comes to the information overload that our technology has generated, you're obviously have in place now the technological solution, and that's what we tend to do, and it will create more problems in turn. But just as far as information overload is concerned, we do have the means, we're developing the means, and they exist and haven't been fully implemented to deal with that particular problem of overload.
I think the AI part of this conversation is really fascinating. I mean, it's on everyone's mind, I think, and there are lots of conversations going on. At the original point, I think when I was expressing some concern over how complicated and sophisticated maybe the systems we'd created, or the way we've made them more sophisticated through technology and possibly taken them out of our own hands, it isn't so much that we were always in control, I suppose. I mean, I think of it a little bit more like you think about car engines, and there was a certain point where even a home some enthusiast could poke around a little while and figure out how to do this, that, or the other thing. There was only a few parts to look at. It's not to say people didn't hurt themselves or blow up their cars, but by and large, you could teach somebody to fix a car engine in your home garage. You could get a level of education that allowed you to do it at a faster, more sophisticated way. But then as we've added layer upon layer upon layer of new things into automobiles, the car engine is now only partly mechanical, and lots of it is hardware and software, computer hardware and software. And I think I'm trying to use that as an analogy to the other kinds of systems and things that look in some ways familiar to us because they're built on a foundation of a very simple and familiar solution to problems, but they've been injected with all the things that make the world supercharged, so to speak, now. And so if the car engine is out of the hands of the amateur in some ways now, and even the experts require a certain set of, new layers of expertise on top of what they already knew, it stands to reason that we might outpace our ability to do that successfully. And if we do that pervasively in every system, where in the past problems have been harmful, disastrous, catastrophic. I mean, they haven't been apocalyptic necessarily, and that would be, I think that's what aligns with the general emotional fear surrounding how far technologies have taken these systems away from, what we consider to be an easy to understand human life world, but also possibly in real terms as well. And I don't know the real terms. That's a very big problem to think about, but that is in terms of what's going on. I suppose that's one of the things that is an ongoing concern of mine, is that yes, it's an illusion that we're in control. We've probably never been in particularly wonderful control of anything, but there's a difference in how out of control we are now and what the consequences are. Because as I said when I started off, in terms of our flesh and blood, we are not very different than those creatures that emerged, 300,000 years ago as Homo sapiens.
Well, you also brought up in the beginning, the one thing that we are most out of control with is climate change, right? We are past the tipping point from everything that we're reading from the science, and it may very well be our comeuppance as everyone's writing about the Anthropocene and the age of humans and looking toward its end game. So, but by the way, while you were talking about cars, don't you like having heated seats?
Not in the summer.
Really, but when I think about the analogy of cars, and it's, that my father knew everything about cars, he loved cars, and I know nothing. But the fact is that if something's wrong with my car, I would be helpless, except that my car tells me, it tells me that something's wrong with the engine, or it tells me that the tire, there's something wrong with the tire. It communicates to me. That is the trade-off that we get, that actually that information is no longer something that only somebody with some specialized knowledge has. Because there always were people who really knew cars, but then there were a lot of people who didn't know anything about them. Now we have a much more even playing field, and isn't that a trade-off? Now, you can say maybe it was better the old way, but it's certainly a trade-off. It's not gone completely one way or the other.
But to your point for a second, Lance, I was talking to Thom this morning, and I told him that, every time I get my car serviced, they turn off all the engine lights and things that are on, and then within a few weeks, they all come on again. And it's in the past I used to take it to the mechanic and say, all the car lights are on, and they go, I don't know what's wrong with it, and they just turn them off again, and then 2 weeks later they're on again. And I've just gotten to the point where it doesn't tell me the truth about my car very often, so I've sort of given up on it.
Well, that's a problem with the technology not working as well as it's supposed to, which will obviously be improved by better technology. And again, it's also the trap, because there's no way out except more technology and more and more. And that ultimately doesn't give us a way out of that situation. I would say, I'm thinking about climate change. And I totally agree that, we're in a very bad situation, but it was a long time in making. And we're certainly, I remember again my childhood where we, cars had used leaded gasoline, where I remember the incinerators and smokestacks, and just walking. I remember as a little kid walking to school, and just ashes falling from the sky, and there were these things called ash cans, where refuse was just put into them, burned, refuse without any bags or anything like that, just totally out there. And as Thom mentioned, the Hudson River was in a horrendous shape. So obviously what we're doing isn't enough, and it's very hard to on such a massive scale to shift things into a new mode, but we're certainly more aware of it. We're forced to be aware of it, and maybe we won't be able to fix the problem, and maybe we'll go extinct. But I think we're in a better mindset to be thinking about it and addressing the problem now than we were, say, 50, 60 years ago. It's just unfortunate that the things that we did since the 19th century have become so hard to do a 180 and to reverse on, that it's like trying, when you have like a ship, like a big giant, like whatever, aircraft carrier, and you can't just suddenly turn on a dime. And that's the part of the problem that we're facing, is that we're well aware of what needs to be done, but people are not willing to suffer the massive disruption that would cause, and also the pain and death. Because ultimately it is going to cost lives to fix this problem, just as much as it's costing lives, or maybe not just as much as it's costing lives, but as much as it will cost lives to persist and to not fix the problem. So we're in this very difficult situation. I don't know if it qualifies as a double bind to catch-22, but it certainly approaches that kind of situation where you're screwed. You're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't do, in a lot of ways.
As we've been talking about these, models and frameworks for understanding things, Lance, I'm going back to, and I don't remember the citation, but the open and closed model. That reminded me of, Postman talking about the thermostatic view, and when things are out of balance, the system goes back to or seeks equilibrium once again, and then it tilts to far to the other side, and it goes. And so the modern environmental movement, I guess, begins in the 60s and begins with Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. And this is when things like the Hudson River started being cleaned up, air pollution, water pollution, getting to unleaded gas from leaded gas. But then, of course, when you talk about the pain that we might be experiencing as we try to figure out how to lessen our own carbon footprint and do the kinds of things that where we're taking personal responsibility. It's, of course, corporations like the oil companies, trying to, over the years, ignore climate science and tell us it's all, propaganda. Maybe, again, we are at the point where we're looking at the tilt back toward environmentalism, where the corporations who are responsible for continuing us down this very unfortunate and perhaps species-ending role that they're playing. Maybe there's enough of a groundswell among us to bring things back to equilibrium, but then the question becomes, well, are we too late?
Yeah, and of course, entropy is equilibrium, and so the ultimate equilibrium is the heat death of the universe. So you want to find a better balance than that.
Don't end on that note, Lance.
The universe wins.
I wasn't planning to.
Yeah, that would be that's a miserable way to end.
Susan, do we have a solution in the legal sphere?
Doubtful. No, I'm not touching that one.
I think we're in a better position.
I'd like to think there's always an appeal, but we are kind of the end of the universe. I don't think that we can appeal that.
Thanks.
I just, to the point of us being in a better position to make certain decisions because of the things that we know. And I wonder who's we. I mean, if we're talking about scientists, I agree, but then not to revert back to the first 2 minutes or 5 minutes of our conversation, but there's politicians and their unwillingness to begin to turn the ship around is non-existent. And if we depend on governments that think the way Thom was describing than what. And just on a lighter note, to go back to the car metaphor, do you remember Neil saying the questions that you should ask about technology, right? What is the problem to which electric windows are the answer? On the same note, what is the problem to which all of those lights going off, Mike, is an answer?
I think I would assume that it's the problem is that I'm unaware of all of the sophisticated things that could go wrong with my car, and I'd better pay attention to them. But in reality, they're just more flashing lights in a world full of bubbles, beeps, pokes, lights,
have
and things.
You tried to find in a manual what any of those symbols mean anyway?
I have, yeah, and it doesn't make much sense to me. You know, it's sort of the boy who cried wolf. Maybe one day some terrible thing will happen while I'm driving, knock wood. It doesn't, but yeah, it's, we're pinged and buzzed and alerted, and things call for our attention constantly now. And I think the overall effect is that you stop paying attention to anything. Right? And it's sort of I don't know. I frequently wonder if that's my Gen X attitude shining through, that nothing matters. We're the nothing matters generation. But yeah, I think at a certain point, once you're overwhelmed with all of these symbols and attention getters, you stop paying attention, because you realize that aside from a very few things, that most of it is inconsequential.
Well, maybe the problem is that we need better maps for the territory, and that when maps are confusing, you get lost. And when maps have too much information, you can't read them. You can't figure out what is what on them. So is this something that general semantics can help to solve? And maybe this would be a good way to conclude our session by hearing from all of you. Can general semantics help? How can general semantics help to address these problems that we've been agonizing over for this past period of time? Please, Thom, would you like to say something?
I'll go back to what Mike just said, claiming his Gen X-ness. Mike, I know you. I actually have been hearing you through the wall, because we do have an office right next to one another as we're doing this. And I know that you know, and you think, and you believe that everything matters. And I think that that's one of the underlying principles for what general semantics is for, and why we need it, because everything matters, and it is our human endeavor to try to make sure that we try to do everything in our power to make sense of things and come up with a sane response. And, again, we keep coming back to climate change and saying, well, might be too late on that note, but with respect to everything else, it all does matter. And this is the mechanism that we use to try to improve our lot, to save ourselves, and to enjoy the ride.
I would disagree just with one little thing. Not everything matters. I mean, you've raised children. You have told them, pay attention to what's really important. You'll feel much better if you do. Not everything matters, but I think general semantics can help in mapping out, just like Lance said, what's more important, where to take the turn, how to read the map.
I stand corrected. Thank you.
Mike, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, that's Thom. I mean, that's Thom knowing me, that I definitely am a person of at least two minds, that my sort of generational sensibility is nothing matters, but that I actually care deeply about a lot of things, which is why I invest myself in thinking about them and talking about them with folks like you. I think the thing, at least from my point of view, that matters the most in a world that has abstracted itself so far from the condition that I've referred to a couple times, that flesh and blood that arrived here in the form of Homo sapiens some tens and hundreds of thousands of years ago. I think the remedy for that is to remember what matters to us from the point of view of our basic survival, and from the point of view of what makes a human life good. And that word is slightly problematic, but once you explore the things down at the basics, at the basic level, sensory experiences and how you translate them into language and what that language then creates in an imaginative world, a series of maps, a set of possibilities. If you go back to that grounded level of humanness, I think you arrive at some answers to what's good. And those things have an ethical quality, and they act as a guide to seeking good in others and in the things you do with others. There's nothing more important to me in communication education than that. So I suppose those are the kind of maps that I'm interested in learning about and teaching about.
Susan?
Well, I do like the idea of the map of having become so complicated. To me, one of the really interesting things right now is levels of abstraction and how removed I think some of us become from what our kind of mediated lives are, from what the reality of experience, of lived experience is. And I'm concerned that the more engrossed we become with our virtual lives and our virtual experiences, the less we really understand the importance of kind of the corporeal existence and the corporeal experiences. There's a way of removing yourself from calls for violence, for example, that I think we've become desensitized. And I'm very concerned with that. And I think that general semantics kind of helps us focus on the importance of that kind of change in our perception.
Well, these are all great words of wisdom as we think about better maps and getting closer, as close as we can, to the actual territory. I want to thank our roundtable for a stimulating, maybe depressing, but hopefully not, discussion with Eva Berger, Thom Gencarelli, Susan Drucker, Mike Plugh. I also want to welcome Tiffany Gilliam, our producer, our new producer for this session. Hi, Tiffany.
Hello, happy to produce and listen and learn.
Yes, and so it's great to have you on board. And thank you to all of our listeners as we celebrate our 1-year anniversary of Semantic Reactions. Thank you all.
You've been listening to our September 2023 episode of Semantic Reactions, featuring a roundtable discussion with Eva Berger, Susan Drucker, Thom Gencarelli, Michael Plugh, and Lance Strate. If you like what you've heard, or even if you haven't, please consider becoming a member of the Institute of General Semantics, if you're not one already. In addition to supporting our efforts, IGS members receive an annual subscription to our journal, etc., a review of general semantics, access to our online and in-person events, lectures, and seminars, and discounts on the books and audiovisual materials that we sell. Regular membership is only $50 and half off for students. Your membership and any additional donations you care to make will help to support our offerings and activities as we work to bring a measure of sanity to the world. The Institute of General Semantics is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to research and education on a wide range of topics. They include language and symbols, meaning and perception, communication and representation, media and technology, science and epistemology, creativity and critical thinking. We are dedicated to making the world a better place through practical strategies for improving our semantic environment, individually and collectively. For more information about the Institute and our activities, and to become a member and supporter of our work, please visit our website at generalsemantics.org. That's generalsemantics, one word, .org. And this brings to a close our 13th episode of Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. This is Ben Houck, signing off, saying, we hope you'll join us next time. And until then, just remember this simple fact, that the map is not the territory.